Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for today's press conference. This is really an important message that we want to get out to the community related to our efforts to mitigate school threats and to make sure that we're safeguarding really our most valuable assets, which is our children. To begin with, I have to talk about some of the partnerships and people who are here today, and then I'll explain to you their roles and what we were able to accomplish. Joined up here today with me is Captain Mike Reggio. You all have seen him before. He is the commander over our real-time crime center and leading up our threat management unit. We also have our threat management unit detective, Mike Ryan, Detective Jessica Abrams, Deputy Kevin Tyree, and we are also accompanied with the ATF Special Agent in Charge, Tyree Cunningham, as well as two Coral Springs detectives, both Chad Whittington and Tom Fiola. It's important to get this out in terms of the partnership of what was done here and recognize these individuals first. For those of you who have been tracking and monitoring the efforts that we've introduced going back now to 2019 upon me accepting command of this office, we really had to hunker down and start focusing on how do we advance our investigative practices to ensure that we are doing comprehensive follow-ups on those individuals who would pose some form of threat to our schools. And that led to the development of our threat management unit. Over the last several years, they conducted over 1,500 plus investigations. They've arrested over 200 individuals. And then we've also redirected or shift individuals who suffered from mental health disorders or indicators that they may need some form of resources or support about 730 times. And that's unique. It's not something that's really happening across the state in the way that we're doing it. But of those 200 plus investigated, the 1,500 plus that we've evaluated, this case here today proves the importance behind, one, the investment we've made in this administration behind this real-time crime center and the threat management unit, as well as the partnership elements that exist in it. Every single municipal law enforcement entity have been afforded an opportunity to partner in our real-time crime center, in our threat management team. Coral Springs has jumped onto that process, as well as the ATF. And so what am I talking about? Why am I giving you this long story about this threat management team and the efforts? Because out of all the investigative practices that they've conducted since this indoctrination, this is probably the most severe individual that we've been able to apprehend and take off the streets, and we did it right before the school year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're dealing with today. We've been able to effectuate an arrest on an individual named Robert Mondragon. He's a local resident. We have had an extensive amount of experiences and encounters with him from a law enforcement capacity, not just here at the Broward Sheriff's Office, but going across multiple jurisdictions throughout the county, from Davie PD to Weston to Tamarack to Parkland, you name it. This individual has been popping up on the radar going back to 2013. I'll say that again. He has been on the radar going back to 2013. The encounters, the nature of the encounters that we had, multiple attempts at suicide, multiple calls for services related to he having a desire to create an active shooter event in our school systems. And so coming up early in July or so, we got intel coming into our Parkland district that an individual, unknown at the time, was going out to the MSD memorial site on the school grounds and conducting sacrificing animals on this site. And so our threat management unit, having seen this and working with the detectives and officers in Parkland, initiated a surveillance operation to ensure that we can track down and figure out precisely who this individual was. And that led to us capturing Mr. Mondragon on video, seeing him out at these site locations, and that led into a really elaborate investigation that yielded a lot of things that, quite frankly, startled me and made me also very proud that we were on top of this one and not waiting for the byproduct of violence to happen first. And so with that investigation, some of the things that we were able to discover executing the search warrant is that this individual had an alarming amount of inquiries on the internet, looking at old active shooter events from Columbine, looking at ways and manners to perform and develop pipe bombs, looking at ways to kill officers, looking at the kill counts for victims at one shooting from another across this country. And it became pivotal that we would utilize whatever criminal charges that were going to be afforded to us to take this person off the street. And the initial charges that our investigators were able to introduce was related to defacing the memorial site, which is a felony. And that gave us an opportunity to get this individual off the street. But my focal point here today is not just talking about the great investigative efforts that these men and women have taken behind me and beside me, but looking at the nature of, one, how we are operating as an organization now, the effectiveness behind the threat management unit, the real-time crime center, but also almost putting out a call for action to our partners in this criminal justice system. You've seen by this timeline the amount of things that we have done as law enforcement to try to reduce a form of violence taking place in this community. Arrests, Baker Acts, you name it. We've done our job from the law enforcement capacity. But this criminal justice system is comprised of other tiers. It is not only law enforcement, it's the courts, and this is the segment that I want to look at when we're talking about the courts and prosecution. We cannot afford to have this individual come back into society in hope that he doesn't introduce violence, in hope that he doesn't shoot up a school, in hope that somehow he gets the necessary mental health treatment that he needs. These are not the responsibilities of law enforcement officials anywhere in the country. We are task saturated, we are working diligently, we're doing the things that you expect of us, but we need our state attorney, we need our courts to really hammer down to make sure that this individual doesn't go back on the street. And I'll speak very candidly and frankly about what I can see happening here. If this cycle continues, this individual is going to impact or have two outcomes really occur. One, he's going to execute an active shooter event in this community, and he's going to kill someone. And then we're going to kill him. And so, as the chief law enforcement officer of this county, I am responsible for the preservation of life first. And in order to do that, he needs to remain off of these streets, because we will not allow for this event or this individual or anyone that fits this mold in our community to go back into the community and prey upon our children, workplaces of environments, and many others. There's been too many active shooter events to take place across this country to tell us that that cannot be on the streets. And so with that, I want to say again, thank you to all our partners up here from the ATF, Coral Springs, Captain Riggio, our threat management unit. And I'm going to open this up for maybe questions. And keep in mind, if there's any specific questions that you have for any of our partners, just feel free to say, we have a comment or question for the ATF, Coral Springs, et cetera, and then we'll work it that way. So I'll start perhaps here.
Sheriff, how do you get that message to the next level? You're having a press conference, obviously. Will you stand before a judge and say, you're on what you just told us? How do you get the message to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you before the press conference came, the phone calls went. And I've already talked to the chief judge and starting to communicating with the state attorney about the importance behind this, and they understand it. This was a very time-intensive investigation that led to this apprehension, and like God all means, thank you. We're happy that we were successful here in the investigation. But there may be another one of these out on the streets. There's a very good chance that there's another individual who's suffering from all these different defects, who've been in and out of the criminal justice system only to go back into the street. And we're hoping that he or she doesn't commit this type of violent atrocity. So yeah, that partnership's important. Communications are ongoing. And again, that applied pressure will be worked behind closed doors, because I have a very good working relationship with the state attorney and the chief judge, and they get it. They understand it.
Will that video be made public? And if not, can you tell us what you see on that video?
The videos from the surveillance, I can give you a highlight review of it. Some of the things that our surveillance team was able to capture was seeing him literally walk the same path of the previous shooter at MSD. There's captures of him, leaving different dead animals and things of that nature out on site. But more beyond that behavior is just looking at the legitimate threat spectrum that exists. And we have different classifications here within our threat management unit, and I can tell you he is at the top of that food chain. Many of you know that I've always had a passion for active shooter. That was kind of my specialty in law enforcement, and I have read hundreds and hundreds of case studies going back as far as really the Texas shooting, the tower shooting back at University of Texas, and looking at how these things pattern. And he fits the mold. All the indicators that are recently released by the FBI, their behavioral science unit, and everything else. He fits every classification that it's coming. A shooting's going to happen. So I want to keep him off the street.
So that being said, between 2013 and now, would you say our community is extremely lucky that nothing has happened?
I think I would phrase that we've been lucky, and luck is not a strategy, right? It's a destination for failure. But the investment that we've made in 2019, having learned from Stoneman Douglas, has proven that it's possible to thoroughly investigate these cases, direct individuals to mental health care when they need it, and then also assure that we can get ahead of it through partnerships throughout this county, because this wasn't singularly done by BSO. We had Coral Springs involved. We looked at the school systems. We worked with all these different partners, which we didn't do before Stoneman Douglas. But I don't want to get lax in that. I don't want to get complacent and say because we're having success, we're capturing everybody, right? There's 2 million people in this county spread across 30+ cities. So if the hope is we'll continue to apprehend this, we need to shift the mindset and the paradigm to say we need to make sure we have people in custody that deserve to be in custody. And then I have one back here.
You just made your plea to the courts, to elected officials. Public pressure obviously can help too. What can the public do, if anything, to increase that pressure?
I think the public has an important part in terms of engagement, understanding what these type of events look like in terms of active shooters, also understanding the threat matrix in terms of certain persons and things that they may be working with. Apparently this individual in this case had worked at Walmart and had made numerous different types of threats to shoot up that facility, et cetera. And my curiosity there is, well, how much education did the employees get about active shooter preparedness? How much content were they able to be given to understand what to do should this individual show up for work? So yeah, the community has an engagement element that's most certainly essential. We can't do this on our own, and they need to be our eyes and ears. Feed us the intelligence, talk to us about those people who you know on a personal level that are suffering from some type of mental defect or disorder, who've made these type of threats repeatedly. Feed that information to us so our threat management unit and our partners can investigate it. Not all investigations end in arrest, as I alluded to earlier, giving some of the statistics, right? 1,500 plus investigations, 200 were effectuated into arrest. But the 730 plus that were shifted over to mental health care facilities or resources, that is huge, because now I know we have them in the system, they're getting care. If they're not getting that care, then we're alerted and we can do a follow-up and find out what's going on.
Assuming this person's convicted, spends his time in jail, it's probably not a life sentence that he'll be having. He'll be out on the street eventually, I suspect. What's your thought about after he's served his time?
I think there's 2 responsibilities we have in this society. One, the preventative measures to make sure that this individual is not on the streets when he's committed a crime. And in this case, we have felony charges. We want to see the full letter of the law executed in the sense of the maximum penalty possible, right? The past patterns, the propensity towards violence, all these things should measure up in the courtroom for consideration. The judge needs to evaluate that. The state attorney needs to express that consideration. The second element is we have partners. The ATF will be pursuing federal charges related to weapons violations. That's why they're here. I'd like to see both of those things supplemented so that if there's state time served, immediately going into federal time served, and that creates somewhat of a buffer space of keeping this individual off the streets for as long as possible. But the other segment that needs to happen after the criminal charges and prosecution is handled is we need to ensure that this person goes over to mental health care and receive consistent treatment. The deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities that took place in the 1960s have penalized our entire society. And we have a lot of people running around out through this community that suffer from mental health illness and they're not getting the resources that they need. That is not a law enforcement responsibility, although we've undertaken it within our behavioral science unit to make sure we're doing as much as we can.